My wish to vomit persisted. It hadn't ceased, so to speak, since the day before last. I went to look for a bottle of bad champagne. I drank a chilled glass of it. After a few minutes, I got up to go and vomit. After vomiting, I went back to bed. I was slightly comforted, but the nausea wasn't long in returning. I was gripped by trembling and chattering of the teeth. I was obviously sick. I suffered in a very bad fashion. I fell back into a sort of fearful sleep. Everything began to come unhooked, things that were obscure, hideous, unformed, that it was absolutely necessary to stabilize. There was no way to do so. My existence came apart, like rotten matter. Bataille. The semiology associated with the death of the author is formulated in terms of an antinomy of authority. It accepts a question of intention, proceeds to resolve it negatively, and then moves on to a theory of indeterminate significations, which valorizes the process of reading. What is at stake in the cruder variants, Bart, is a dialectic of authority, which redistributes the site of legislation from writer to reader. More intricate accounts take things further, so that with Lacan and Derrida, the position of authority is itself subverted by the general text, in which the reader, as much as the author, was always already enmeshed and surpassed. In all of these cases, death is thought of as the necessity that something does not reach us, and could never reach us. The transcendental impossibility of anything reaching us builds death/castration into the movement of signification, as the archi-absentiality that articulates, effaces, base contact. It is hard to imagine that anything could prevent Bataille's writing being flipped speculatively into this mirror space of frustrated representation, but this does nothing to increase the persuasiveness of such a move. If one is first prepared to think of the death infesting Bataille's writing as his death, in a gesture that can then be transcendentally exacerbated to undermine the general possibility of the proper, and thus of the ownness of death, whilst nevertheless retaining the pathos of a ruined presence, then Bataille can indeed be deconstructed with considerable technical meticulousness. Nowhere in this procedure is the contagious positivity of death touched upon. It is a matter of principle that nothing is touched upon, nor its fluidity, intensity, explosive impersonality, or solar luxuriance. Always the titillation of suspended meaning, and never the impact of oblivion. Loss is thought as a deduction from anticipated lucidity, not as a variable positive veracity. On the one hand, death as the ultimate nostalgia of signification, on the other, death as the virulent flux of communication. It is not that Bataille or his signifying intentions are blocked by death. It is rather that death is blocked by civilization in such a way that it is merely represented as an impossible signification, or as an impossibility of signification. That Bataille should arise as a hermeneutic topic, more or less problematized by the empirical or transcendental death of the person, is itself the symptom of a far more basic inhibition, operating at a level continuous with impersonal death. In other words, death is not the principle of the ascetic law of representation, but the final term of the forbidden. With every word that one writes about Bataille, one compounds a misunderstanding, contributing to an ordered representation of crime and oblivion. It could be said that the issue here is that of a paradox, but that is mere subordination to a philosophical lexicon, and thus definitive resignation to an accumulative outcome. More urgent by far is the mixture of nausea and fear that accompanies the pre-philosophical impact of Bataille's dilemma, a vertiginous slippage upon the imminence of death. It is then that one grasps every word, read or written, as a desperate scrabbling for escape from isolation. The putting to death of the author by his work writes Bataille, before quoting an astonishing passage from Proust in Inner Experience. After doing so, he resumes the thread. The gods to whom we sacrifice are themselves sacrifice, tears wept to the point of dying. This, in remembrance of things past, which the author would not have written if, broken with pain, he had not yielded to that pain, saying, "Let us allow our bodies to disintegrate." What is this, if not the river flowing in advance to the estuary, which is the sentence itself? Let us, and the open sea into which the estuary empties is death. So much so that the work was not only what led the author to his tomb, but the way in which he died. It was written on his deathbed. The author himself wanted us to feel him dying a bit more at each line. It is only when authors are something other than their death that a literary theory can surgically excise them, when between themselves and their inexistence no communication or continuity occurs. The condition of impossibility for a theory, of authorial absentiality, receives a precise nomination in Bataille's text: literature. One can readily accept that Bataille's discursivity comprises an analyzable semiotic system. It remains only to note one urgent fact, that such discursivity is the thing sacrificed by his text. Œuvre complète de Georges Bataille is a discursive label. The genitive is problematic, of course, as is the proper name, but so are all the elements. Not only works, but complete works, it scarcely seems probable. What do we find in these texts, after all? Even at the discursive level, they seem to suggest that individuality, creativity, and possession are illusions, that literature is something quite other than work, and that completion is inevitably aborted. They dramatize their gaps, absences, discontinuities, repudiate their authenticity, contest themselves. The rafts of coherence one finds are always adrift in disorder and confusion. Tortured juxtapositions, fragments, and abandoned plans abound. Techniques of disintegration operate at all levels of Bataille's texts, tending to distribute it along an axis of maximal fission. The extreme instance of this is the anorexic attenuation typical of his poetry, where the line is stripped of almost all its semantic and syntactic burden to enter into a vertical series of discontinuous cries. The line collapses towards a resilient spinal core, along which shrunken stanzas unstring themselves, like beads dropping from a broken necklace into a dimension of intoxicating descent. Other techniques include extended ellipsis, the employment of two separate gears of paragraphing, with both indentations and vertical line breaks, violent narrative shifts of various kinds. But in the end, it is not a matter of technique. The fragmentation of Bataille's text cannot be domesticated within the subjective genitive. Death itself dissipates, aborts, fragments. Stories forestall completion, organization is lost, draft is spliced corrosively with accomplishment. Whose completion and whose work? Bataille's? His editors? Ours? As we have already glimpsed, there are innumerable theories of the text which might intervene at this point, attempting to persuade us one way or another. Some of these theories are even genealogically contaminated by Bataille's writings, although never more than tangentially so. But what they tend to share amongst themselves is a predisposition to an epistemological, ontological, or ethico-political register, and a certain salutary distanciation from what matters to the text. The epistemo-philiac fixation proper to theory, with its attachment to security, regularity, generalizability, and other cultural forms of insulation, might lead to possible readings of Bataille, but not to a communication, a pestilential seduction by these words, purveyors of the plague. Bataille is less an interesting writer than a loathsome vice, and to be influenced by him is less a cultural achievement than a virological horror. far closer to the spasmodic rot of untreated syphilis than to the enrichment of an intellect. Any theorized death of the author domesticates the infectious wastage through which Bataille's incompletion is spread. His is not the immaculate absence of the semiologists, but a filthy death, as senselessly unmanageable as a scream. We are touched abysmally by the very gesture that removes every authentic trace of his existence from us. His disappearance is a violent communion. In the embers and smudges we inherit under the mark of Bataille, something is deliberated which subverts all possibility of deliberation, as chance and failure are meticulously facilitated, and teleology undoes itself at its peak. Strategy runs itself into chaos in the incomprehensible zone where accidents are planned, and where desire flows freely into loss of control. Will to chance. Ashes to ashes, mess to mess. A virulent irregularity continued into the complexities of a literary estate, into a chaos of books and papers. Death is a completion of sorts, one supposes. This is comforting enough to believe, and thus almost certainly untenable. How pleasant to be rounded off by one's abolition, to be edited by death. This is a way of thinking similar to that of all those who assume they will get better at death, that age will ease them gently into her cold arms. This dream of soft passage is like that of tradition, inheritance, legacy, and memorial, conceiving writing on the model of transmission. It is thought as if it were essentially something received, offering itself successfully to the consummating fulfillment of a deciphering, however tantalizingly problematical this may be. Not only does such a model serve as an implicit apologetics for the cultural commodity process, it also trivializes, by idealization, the mute catastrophe of writing. That the immensely preponderant bulk of writing is lost forever is not a mere empirical accident, far less a phenomenologico-transcendental structure of non-presence, but an effect inherent to the nihilistic core of the literary impulse. At its root, literature is writing for nothing, a pathological extravagance whose natural companions are poverty, ill health, mental instability, and all the other symptoms of a devastated life that is protracted in the shadow of futility. In the current organization of civilization, the facility of contacting a text is, at the very least, radically accidental with respect to its literary intensity. The bare minimum of honesty requires an acknowledgement that literature is spent almost entirely unattended. It is as foreign to us in our social being as an earthquake beneath the sea. Confronting the absolute posed by our inevitable extinction, we feel brave, proud of ourselves. We permit ourselves a little indulgence, swooning in the delectations of morbidity. To face up to death is more than the others do. Our haunted grimace becomes a complacent smile. We run our hands lovingly over the lichen-spattered graves. It is as if we have done our share, as if it were now up to death to make some gesture of reciprocation, of gratitude. How thankful death will be that we accept it so. It will surely favor us for treating it so tolerantly. We even imagine it as an outcast, rejected by all, miserable, hungry, endlessly appreciative of the benefactor who takes it in. Thus it is that death becomes cut to our dimensions, becomes our death, a friend, a little ominous perhaps, a little bleak-hearted, but limited by the modest horizon of its task, that of bringing a definitive end to ourselves. We sit on tombs and imagine the corpse within lying alongside its death, the two of them snuggled together as lovers, mutually satiated by the perfection of their symmetry. What fidelity death shows, what simplicity to its desires, and how cruelly it is spurned. In the final phase of this insanity, we find ourselves choked with pity for our dark and neglected twin. How gentle and soothing, if death were really nothing but ceasing to be. But is there such a thing as mere death? Were there to be, we would never learn of it, for it is only in overreaching itself that death leaves a script. What greater mistake than confusing our death with non-being? Is it because we want to believe in the loyalty of our substance that we make this peculiar equation? If so, we should be ashamed of our dishonesty. The facts are blatant. It is not the case that death leaves matter satisfied. At most, it is a temporary refreshment, a cool black wave for matter to bask in like a reptile, the phase of dormancy before the rush back into the convulsive dissipation of life. Perhaps we feel that our deaths should be more fulfilling, that they should be important enough to quench the most insensate thirst. It is almost as if we still believe in the faithful resurrection of the flesh. How humiliating, then, that matter remains itchy after shaking us from it, that it is still eager, that even before our mourners have forgotten us, it is flirting with the worms. Across the eons, our mass of hydrocarbon enjoys a veritable harem of souls. How much dying can a body do? At least one dose, and even this figure is conservative, except in the case of the most elementary life. A more complex organism is a true economy of death, running off a perpetuated inner catastrophe, shedding its cells into the ocean of ruin. It is the crudest type of error to reserve the word death for total systemic collapse, for the end of dying. Human bodies do not echo the neuroses that inhabit them, staving off disintegration, clutching at postponement, sealing death out. No, they glut themselves on death, traders in devastation, turning themselves over from within. Matter is in flight from the possibility of essence, as if from an original pertinency of ontology, and life is merely the most aberrant and virological variant of this flight, the convulsive fringe of being's relinquishment. Life is an exploration of death, whose motor is an exteriority from which it can never separate itself. It comes closest to co-extension with the principle in its deviation from the echoes of real essence, in its turnover or metabolism. Life smears itself across death as the migration from concrete existence, the meanderings of an ever-accentuated vagrant reproducibility through confusion. No particle is the same, we happily admit, when discussing a body differentiated from itself by a few years. We try not to understand that we are thus accepting the final abandonment by complex life of all allegiance to existence. Life evolves into the embrace of death, becoming a mere turbulence of disappearance, indifferent to its pullulating inner mass, to its inner ruthlessness. To be part of an organism is to become dispensable, and ever more dispensable. No course is more suicidal than that of the living substance that becomes an organ. Bataille writes of the human being, for whom the components die incessantly, such that none of the elements that we were subsists beyond a certain number of years. We are still determined to believe that we have one single and conclusive death awaiting us, a death tailored to the dimensions of a soul. But if a body is a river of death, what makes us so sure a self isn't one? Is it likely that we should really remain the same? It is the most elementary common sense to believe in our existence, of course. But then, would it really be convenient for the body to admit to the ephemera in its nerves that it has so little attachment to them? Animals of the species Homo sapiens, it is rashly suggested, know that they are going to die. Bataille claims so on a very great number of occasions. If this is so, it is perplexing why they act as they do. Nowhere outside humanity is the indefinite postponement of life, named différance in recent times, developed to such a pitch of wretchedness. Which amongst our gestures would remain unchanged if it were to be the last? No impulse amongst us that is not a hesitation, no adventure without reserve. The relation between being and death is commonly understood in one of two ways, either existentially, such that death is thought of as an absolute loss of being in the world, or naturalistically, such that being is considered to be utterly unimpaired, merely rearranged by death. For the implicit existentialist, who is everyone in their moments of naivety, both being and death belong absolutely to that scale consistent with the totality of the human person, whilst for the naturalist being recedes towards a level of fundamental elements, a level at which death is always extrinsic. Heideggerian death is an absolute ontological horizon, whilst thermodynamic heat death, comprehending all natural deaths, is merely energy-conserving disorder. With Bataille, things are different. Being is nowhere, which is to say, it has no privileged scale, no refuge, either in the atom or in the totality. From the perspective of ontology, the compositions at each scale are gnawed by insufficiency, both too friable and too partial to be. Being would be other to death, either annihilated by it or left immaculate, were there not scales. If there were not scales, death would be so sublimely metaphysical. Take Aquinas, for instance. There is no gesture exhibiting a greater fidelity to theology than the differentiating stroke with which he distinguishes decomposition from annihilation. Along with such a difference comes the entitlement to an entire flora and fauna of theistic distinctions: soul-body, essence, accident, creation, metamorphosis, etc. The scales as a whole are grouped together upon the ontological fundament of divine conservation, within which empirical death circulates as an obedient angel of the Lord. Aquinas' reason is of crystal clarity. What is created comes out of nothing, ex nihilo. Now, composite things, composita, come out of their components, componentibus, not nothing, and therefore it is not them exactly that are created. Matter, materia, underlies natural production, and consequently it, and not the concrete thing composed of it, compositum, is what, properly speaking, is created. A simple bilateral disjunction between being and nothing propels Aquinas' thinking here. The economy of being operates within a consistent conservative action, monopolized by an extrinsic author who interdicts any impulse on the part of nature to a direct collaboration with zero. Compositional strata are quarantined from logical differentiations, ghettoized in the sordid slums of a creation that is paternalistically comprehended by divine reason. God is the cause of things through his mind and will, like an artist of works of art. Aquinas.